Science is sure that it's happening, and we're sure that it's caused by people. And where we're stuck is what to do about it. And in this void of action, I think there's a war going on, actually, a communications war.
Hello, and welcome back to Tomayto Tomahto. I am your host, Talia Sherman, as always. And today I'm joined by a voice that I never expected to showcase on this podcast. I'm joined today by not a linguist or even an academic, but senior research scientist at NASA, Josh Willis. Josh is a climate scientist and oceanographer. He studies sea level rise and ocean warming, but he's often found trying to communicate climate science to the public. And this episode centers around the problem and potential of language in communicating climate science. We talk about the line between accessible language and reductionary language, individual versus collective action, the right way to frame a problem, and problems with data when it's not enough to convince people of reality. This episode was obviously a new and different challenge for me on the show, and so I'm very proud to welcome back into your ears, Josh Willis. Josh Willis, welcome to the podcast. Hi.
Thank you. Hey, I'm so glad to be here.
I'm so happy to have you here as well. Tell everyone who you are. You're a bit different from any other guest that's ever been on this show. Why?
I'm just a dude, Talia, just a dude who studies global warming for NASA. So I'm a NASA climate scientist. It's not rocket scientist. A lot of people say I'm a rocket scientist. I'm not a rocket scientist, but I am a climate scientist, and I study the rise of the oceans using satellite data from NASA. And for a bunch of years, I also flew around Greenland studying how the oceans eat away the ice from below. So I'm kind of like an oceanographer, climate scientist, NASA-y kind of guy.
Okay, so then the obvious question is, why are you here? What's the connection between climate change and then this podcast on linguistics that has largely been a podcast on language, especially language and social situations, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the thing with climate change and global warming, I say global warming, by the way. I know it's, some people are like, don't say global warming. But I think the thing is that we've had a major communications breakdown in terms of being able to deal with climate change. So science is sure that it's happening, and we're sure that it's caused by people. And where we're stuck is what to do about it. And in this void of action, I think there's a war going on, actually, a communications war going on between scientists who are trying to say, this is what's happening, and oil company funded entities of all kinds that are basically using language and communications to prevent action. And so it's kind of a war of words.
So when you talk about this kind of war of communications, the thing that first comes to mind to me is how language is being weaponized to warp the message, right? Change the fundamental fact so that people are distracted or fundamentally not interested in engaging with this problem that's very much happening.
Yeah, there's a very famous former Republican operative named Frank Luntz who workshopped words and phrases that would help the Republicans prevent action on climate change. So in fact, I think climate change was one of his inventions. We used to say global warming, and then he was like, no, it's climate change because that doesn't sound as bad, right? I mean, this is the guy that invented words like the death tax instead of the estate tax, right? So it wasn't like an accident that we're having trouble. There've literally been people designing phrases and language to stop action.
Okay, so basically a fundamental problem sometimes with not only linguistics, but really any medium that uses language as its primary whatever, is that how do you figure this stuff out when the very way that you figure it out is the way that it was constructed, right? How do you figure out the novel when the novel is, how do you figure out your own head if your own head is mediated by language? How do we, right, this is it's completely circular, right? This is different because it's not through language that the planet is dying. It's not through language that the globe is warming, right? And yet the way that we're making sense of this problem is very much via language and communication, and also through, elected representatives or not elected representatives that basically make the rules, right? but that's a very interesting way of putting it. That the guy who invented the death tax is also the guy that's like, don't say climate. So for the rest of this interview, should we say global warming? Is that
well, I say both because both are actually true. It depends a little what you're talking about, right? Because I study the rise of the oceans, and that happens because the planet's warming, but it's more complicated than that, right? It's not just warming. The oceans are warming, and that's causing some of the rise, but they're also getting extra water from melting glaciers and ice sheets, and that's causing some of the rise. So climate change is more complicated, right? We're also having more intense storms. Wildfires are getting more and more out of control. So climate change kind of covers all that. It's not wrong to say climate change, but it's all triggered by global warming. So both are really true. And I also don't like to, even though sometimes the opposition might have invented a phrase, it doesn't mean that I can't still use it. Like, I just need to know why they invented it and use it in a way that I think serves my purpose instead of theirs.
Okay. So basically, talk to me about what you do. Tell me literally what you do as if I am a NASA climate scientist. We're going to do a little experiment here. We're going to have you tell me what it is you do, what's wrong with the planet, what you're doing to fix it. Just a little short little soundbite, as if I'm your intellectual peer in the sense that I know the same methodologies. I'm in the room.
So here's a question. So I actually have spent the last 20 years trying to communicate about climate change and become a better communicator about it. And after all that time, I basically talk to my colleagues the same way I talk to the public. What I've found is that it's actually more effective with my colleagues as well as the public to speak plainly. So, occasionally some jargon terms pop out, but that's how I roll. So, do you want me to talk like me as a climate scientist talking to a climate scientist, or do you want me to talk like one of my fellow climate scientists talks to me?
The latter.
Okay. All right. So, one of my fellow climate scientists would say something like, anthropogenic warming is driving increased heat uptake, ocean heat content increase, and is also driving ice-ocean interactions in places like Greenland and Antarctica, where subglacial runoff is driving mixing underneath the ice shelf, which enhances ice melt, causes increased calving, reduces basal friction, and ultimately drives increased discharge, which, when unbalanced by increased mass accumulation from snow, will eventually cause sea levels to rise. You can tell, it's funny, I had to go slow because it's not natural for me anymore to talk like that.
Yeah. Okay, so then how would you say it?
So how I would say it is that humans are heating up the planet. The oceans are absorbing over 90% of that heat, and that's causing sea levels to rise. But the warm water is also eating away at glaciers from below and causing Greenland and Antarctica to dump more ice in the oceans and raise sea levels too.
Okay. Now, how would you say it if you were really talking to a young person, a Republican member of Congress, maybe the guy that invented this whole... Yeah, how would you say it to him? Yeah.
We're heating up the planet and raising the sea levels.
Why is that bad?
Because we live in a society that was made for the climate of 10,000 years ago. And we're changing our planet into a climate that we've never had to deal with before. So all of our cities are in the wrong place, our farms are in the wrong place, and it's very expensive to move them.
Great answer. That's a great answer. I actually really love that. You just made that problem applicable and universal to everyone. You included both the rural and urban population centers of the United States and of every other nation. Wow. Okay.
Thanks. I've been practicing.
You said this before. We know this is happening. We know that humans are causing it. It sounds like we know exactly what we need to do to fix it, right? Or at least you, being a NASA climate scientist, would know that. Why aren't we doing more?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, because it's hard. It actually is hard. Everything we do depends on on fossil fuel use. So it's not easy. But the other reason is because companies make a huge amount of money on oil. And right now, our government structure is set up to make it easy for them to do that, and hard for companies that make money by creating energy from like the sun or wind or water. It's harder for them. They don't get as many freebies as the oil companies from the government. And so right now we're still incentivizing paying off the oil companies when we should be paying off the solar panel companies. There's always some inertia in society, of course, and in the economy too. These companies have been making money doing this for centuries now. And we're reluctant to give up what companies would consider free money that's in the ground, right? It's just hard to do. And we can get free money from photons from the sun, but because we've been getting free money from oil in the rocks, we're doing that instead.
But talk to me about the difference between the change that can be done, should be done by individuals versus corporations. You seem to be focusing a lot in your answers here about the way that the government handles this versus the individual citizen. But obviously, there's been a lot of work on this about how like the way that corporations and political structures and politicians tell us to fight climate change is individually, right? Is recycle, is, pick up trash, is put solar panels on your house versus like on a power plant or something. What's your opinion? What is going on there, and what is worse? I guess my bigger question is what is worse?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, look, we can all make a difference, right? I mean, yes, you should recycle. You should try and get a fuel efficient car. You can turn your air conditioner, down a couple notches, right? But at the end of the day, we have to fix it systemically. Like we got in this situation together with our governments and corporations, building the economy around fossil fuels, around gas, coal, and oil. So if we're going to get out of it, we need them all on board. And the individual, kind of guilt trip is a little bit of another stalling tactic, right? Well, if you can tell people that it's just because you didn't recycle that plastic bag, that's why the world is warming, and you can convince them of that, then maybe you buy yourself another decade of not having to do anything about climate change. And so these are all very deliberate. I mean, that's why these things are in the public sphere. It's not an accident. This is a very carefully considered tactic for stalling. And I think the oil companies know that eventually time is going to run out. But the longer they wait, the bigger the profit margin, right? So it's expensive to change over to building solar panels or wind farms or things that use ocean waves. I mean, there's all kinds of really creative technology, but supplying the demand is going to take a real investment from those companies. They're going to have to spend money and accept risk, and it's going to be hard. And some of the big companies will probably fail in the changeover. So they're scared, right? These companies, but that's the marketplace. Isn't that, capitalism? Like some of the companies die. If they don't, then it's not really a free market, is it? I think there's this kind of idea that capitalism requires the companies to compete to be successful, but the companies don't really want to compete. They want to collaborate and maximize their profits. So there's not any competition really. So in a sense, I think, the system's a little bit rigged. I think it's important to call out that hypocrisy. Maybe that's one of our weapons in trying to enact change, is to remind these folks that, hey, you're not really living by this standard that you say is the most important part of our economy, and just hold them to account. I think that's where language is important, and one of the things we haven't exploited really in terms of communicating about climate change. There's opportunities there too. I went to a conference in New York a couple of weeks ago, and there was all these companies that are trying to build an economy around renewable resources and renewable fuels. But it's tough out there because the big oil companies have a foot on their neck, right?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of political science work on the monopolization, like how monopolization has become a core tenet of what is now considered capitalism. I mean, a lot of people would say that we're not really in capitalism anymore. We're in like a late capitalist stage. And part of that is there's this great, I forget the name of the author, but a book article, Jihad versus McWorld. I don't know if you've heard of that.
No.
It's really good.
Sounds
and
terrifying.
It's basically, no, it's really interesting. It's basically, the argument is like, or the question is there are like these opposing forces, basically, that Jihad and McWorld, like Jihad being like tribalism and nationalization or nationalism, stuff like that. And then McWorld being like monopolization, like super, late capitalist, whatever, like standardization, globalization, right? And how these are opposing forces, but ultimately the argument is that perhaps McWorld wins. And I feel like we're seeing that when it comes to what you just said of like, there isn't really competition. There's just a lot of monopolization. And there's just a lot of concentrated power. The last episode with my guest, Jonathan Rosa, who's a professor of education at Stanford, we talked about lots of processes of overdetermination, whether it's like ontological overdetermination, like linguistic overdetermination, whatever, where data is not taken in the way that it, like the literal reality is not accepted. So there's, huge bodies of work on the fact that non-standard varieties of speaking of English, non-standard varieties of any language are still systematic languages, dialects, whatever you want to call it, and yet they're very heavily stigmatized and considered like wrong and bad and broken ways of speaking, right? That's like extensively empirically proven and established that like all varieties of language like everywhere are systematic and great. Okay, cool. I divulged in the last episode, and that will be coming out. I grew up in an anti-vax household, and yet obviously we know that vaccines do not cause autism. Okay, and yet we have all kinds of stuff on Facebook telling people otherwise. So data sometimes works, but it doesn't seem to always work. And so my question here with climate change and with climate denialism is like, okay, we have all this data proving that climate change is real, that humans do it, that it is anthropogenically caused. Is the answer trying to disprove the people that say you're wrong? Like, is the answer fighting back, pushing back, saying, no, look at all my data, I'm going to prove to you that I'm right? Is the answer to work within their dialectic? Like, is that the answer, to work within that logic? Or is the answer to just completely disregard that and, like, move to the side and say, like, doing this? Because, with in terms of, like, the field of, like, sociolinguistics or other things, Jonathan Rosa's framework being this racial-linguistic framework is to say, I'm not going to engage with that idea. I'm not going to engage with the question that says, what if these people are just broken individuals? Like, he's not engaged with that question. Are you going to try to engage? Are you trying to engage with like the climate denialism by disproving it, or is that not interesting to you?
Yeah, so there's a couple things in there. I think climate scientists especially went through this journey. I think we're most of the way through it now. I like to think that where we believed that showing enough data proving that climate change was real would convince people. And there's actually been some research on this. It doesn't. The short answer is the more details and facts and pieces of evidence you present people, the less and less effective it becomes. And essentially, you're not speaking their language. You're speaking your own language. You're asking them to meet you in your scientist world, where you recognize the value of how hard it was to get some measurement and what it means and what its context is for the planet. But when we tell the public that climate change is real and it's caused by people, what we're really doing is we're communicating with them that as an expert, I've looked at all the data and this is the conclusion. So we're actually asking people to trust us. And I think climate scientists all for a long time felt like they weren't comfortable with asking the public to trust them. They want the public to trust the data. They want the public to trust the facts and the research. But really, that's not how the public works. And deniers know that the public is not going to research what they're doing. If I make up a hypothesis about how CO2 can't trap heat because it flies out into space, which is a real like global warming denier argument, no one's going to check. Like what if I tell that to you on the street, even if you're very smart and very savvy, you don't have the equipment to test CO2 ejection from the planet's atmosphere into the solar system. How are you going to check? So deniers often latch onto these arguments that can be easily disproven scientifically, but are impossible for a layperson to distinguish from reality. And so, in a sense, they're actually using the fact that scientists don't speak the same language as people to convey the opposite message. And there's actually been papers about that. Climate scientists have been talking about this for a long time. There have been studies done. And I think people are starting to realize, climate scientists, at least the younger generations of them, are starting to realize that the way we've been approaching it is just wrong. That we can't try and convince people that climate change is happening, that it's an urgent problem, by dumping a lot of data on them. But now we're stuck in this pattern where deniers are doing that. And so now we feel like we have to respond to the deniers. But we actually don't. What we really need to do is respond to the audience, respond to the people that we're talking to, and try and connect with them on their terms. And so climate scientists are trying to frame messages that do that, but we're starting 20 years later than the competition.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of things that stood out to me there was like you sort of talked about how, at least I wrote down that there's been this exploitation of the linguistic difference, or of like just a difference in understanding between people, and that we can't fix it with more data. And that's really interesting because at least right now in the academy, there's a huge emphasis on data in economics, in sociology, like in most of the social sciences. It's like largely like, no, you need to get the data, right? And like, I don't even think that these things contradict each other at all. Like, I feel like you can still like have a bunch of data to like make your point about tax policy or whatever. But it is interesting that you're saying that we shouldn't fix it with more data about when trying to communicate the climate. I think like maybe that's the difference, is that this isn't about fixing the climate really. This is about communicating that the climate needs, or that the globe needs to be fixed, right? Maybe?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. When you're talking to your colleagues, yes, you need the data. You're going to talk about the data. You need to analyze it. You need empirical evidence to help steer the conversation. And when you're talking to your colleagues, the context for it. You each have different judgments about how valuable it is, about how accurate it is, about how generalizable it is. But you have that conversation with your colleagues, and that's how the field moves forward. But once you're trying to talk to people outside the field, then it doesn't help you to just go, well, look at these thousands of data points, right? And draw the same conclusion as me. No, like they're not going to do that. They don't have the training, they don't have the context, and it just doesn't work because you're asking them to basically get a PhD to talk to you, right? To go spend years and years of their life in college or grad school, like studying what you're studying before they can have this same context for you to understand it together.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I might disagree a little bit just because I feel like maybe this is just me being like overconfident, but like I go to all kinds of talks and conferences around, Brown, and like I'm not like trying to get a PhD in any kind of hard STEM or like most of the social sciences. And I don't know, I think that there's still ideas that can be distilled if you don't have a PhD, right? And so I feel like it's about getting someone to meet you at the level where you can understand the idea, but not necessarily like replicate the experiment, maybe.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is if you're going to present data, if I'm going to present data to non-scientists, then I try and make it as clear as possible, right? And try and help them understand what it really means. Like for me, one of the most important graphs that we make is the rise of the oceans globally averaged over time. And the global surface temperature increase, over the last 200 years gets put in the papers, put on the screen all the time. People have seen it. But the rise of the oceans is very different. It's very smooth. It has all kinds of interesting information in it about the seasonal cycle. So every year, the atmosphere absorbs a bunch of water out of the ocean and rains it down on land. And this actually makes the total average sea level go up and down about 1 centimeter average every year. And it's literally like the heartbeat of the planet because it's the exchange of water from ocean to air to land and back. And so you can see this planet's heartbeat in our data. But on top of that, there's this rise where every year it's getting higher and higher. In the global temperature record. When we have an El Nino, it's unusually warm. And when we have a La Nina, it's unusually cold. And so there's a lot of like other stuff going on. But in the sea level curve, it's global warming. It's gone up almost 10 centimeters in the last 30 years. So the natural back and forth of the water is 1 centimeter and the human signal is 10 centimeters. So you have to build all that context in, because otherwise, if I just show you a plot, an XY plot with a little squiggly line going up, it doesn't mean anything to you, right? And also there's the fact that it's measured by these satellites that are 800 miles up in space. They're bouncing a radar wave off the ocean and measuring how long it takes to go down and come back. And that's how we measure how high the sea levels are. And we can do it with fantastic accuracy and cover the whole planet once every 10 days. So you need all that context to understand what that, the real, why that graph is so important to me as a scientist, right? If I'm trying to convey that, then I need to take the time. And the reason that graph is so important to me is because it has all that context behind it. And if I want somebody to understand why it's important, then I have to bring that context with it. And I have to give them time to kind of sit with why this one squiggly line going up the graph is telling us something about the whole planet.
Okay. Yeah. So there's so much that I feel like is wrapped up in there. So I interviewed a few months ago Alex Walker. He was a fellow at Harvard Law School at the time. And we had a conversation that I don't believe made it into the episode. I will check, though, about basically like the plain English movement, right?
And what you're tapping into is sort of this like plain language movement. And it's like, how do we? And I think this is another thing that, when I was teaching my class last week, we talked about this a good amount. We were like, what would it mean to like have a legal system that actually like talks to the community in a way that like was coherent, in a way that, actually gave people understanding. And it's like,
and I sort of like said like, well, hey, like you can talk about the plain English movement, but like at the end of the day, when I just read your law papers very intensely, last night till 3 a.m. or whatever in the student center, I had to look up like half the words. It's like half Latin and there's a lot of legal jargon and I'm new to this. So I was like struggling through it. And he was like, well, of course, like, yes, there's obviously like a balance between like making my writing acceptable and legible to the legal audience and then also acceptable and legible to like people that aren't, creating this stuff.
Difficult because I'm having to toe this line between being accepted by a legal community that wants a certain type of writing, wants a certain number of footnotes. And it's like, but how do we make legal scholarship more accessible, right? And so I think we need to do both, right? We need to be able to sort of code switch between that legal field that's still a certain way and still will only accept you if you write a certain way.
But he also brought up an important point, which I'm very sympathetic to, which is like, there's actually sometimes a bit of like a semantic distinction between the specific legal jargon word that you'd use and then the way that you'd explain it to like a layperson there might be real value to using specific legal jargon in certain instances because it's just like clearer and more specific. So he gave the example of like domicile. If I change domicile to home, it's not really the same thing like at all.
And there's a question of like, maybe we make it plain, but then all of a sudden it's just tracking a previous legal meaning that has so much content in it that it's just become a new magic word, right? Like I could change the domicile to home, but then there's so much content to the legal concept of a domicile that when I say the word home, are you really understanding what I'm even saying? And so it's a mess.
So with climate communication, and I feel like you were kind of going there with the graph and stuff, are you losing anything by going into a different register by explaining it? Or do you really feel like this actually can be communicated plainly where you don't lose any of the specificity or technicality of the research that you've done?
Yeah, I think that you can. Climate science is going through an interesting thing right now where there's a lot of growth in the fields and a lot of interest. There's a lot of people doing climate science. It started as an atmospheric scientist, but now there's ice scientists and oceanographers and even geologists and people who study rocks and all kinds of things. And we're all trying to talk to each other and we don't all speak the same language. So in fact, actually in my own field, I think it's important to try and speak as plainly as possible. And the fact is that if it takes effort, it's not easy. But the fact is, if you take the time to add the context, then the plain word will work most of the time, right? Like if home is not as specific as domicile, then when you need to say the specific part, you can add it. You just add the language in there. really most of the jargon is about efficiency, is about keeping it short. But if you're trying to explain a new concept, then, keeping it short maybe isn't always the best thing, right? You want to keep it efficient, but you don't necessarily need to throw out the bathwater baby mixed metaphor.
I think it's throw out the baby with the bathwater. Yeah.
Yeah. I would rather throw out the baby, really, personally, but that's okay.
Well, actually, no, let's dig into that. You said to me, and I quote, my contribution to climate change is that I don't have children.
I
thought that was a revolutionary way of putting it. So if you do want to expand on that, you're welcome to.
Yeah, well, it wasn't the original reason that we didn't have children, but my wife and I, for a long time didn't really have a desire, and we're both very busy with our careers. And it was funny, actually. I was talking to William Shatner. He came to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for something, and he was interviewing me about climate change and what I thought. And he asked me if I had kids, and I said no. And he said, "Well, are you not having kids because of climate change?" And I said, "Well, I mean, I don't know. There's a bunch of other things. There's several reasons, and blah 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 blah." And then he said, "Can you say it's because of climate change?" And I'm not saying I say that because of William Shatner, but other than that, I've had a pretty large carbon footprint. I'm a scientist. I have to fly around the world for conferences and sometimes to study Greenland and launch satellites and other things. And so I've done a lot of travel in my life, and that's a big carbon footprint. But it's all more than canceled out by not having kids.
Right. To me, it just illustrates the enormousness of this issue, that you're not having a child would be more consequential than you are literally being like an extremely like important figure in climate science research. Like that to me is just the irony of it. That like, oh wow, like you've actually just been incredibly prolific in your career at NASA and everything, and that will have an impact on like all kinds of research that happens for years and years and years. But also by not having kids, you're really doing your part. So yeah, I agree. Yeah. Totally. No, yeah. Okay, so I want to ask you if a lot of this is about the way that climate change is framed, I kind of want to ask about like your preferred way of framing this problem. What can we do, not necessarily to fight climate change, because it sounds like really what we need to do is like vote for the right people and invest in the right stuff, and like yes, take the individual action. And how do we reframe it? Because I feel like something that it's a pet peeve of mine, but it's a real problem, and like our psychological underpinning right now is I feel so much better because I drive an electric car. Or like it's really just all about like making ourselves feel okay for taking the small steps because we think that that's what makes it right. But like obviously that doesn't matter like at all. But it's like so, and it's so weird how it's been so drilled into us. Like I flinch and like cringe sometimes if I see someone like throw like a clearly recyclable item in like a trash bin. But like, why am I doing that? That literally doesn't matter, right? Like, I should be flinching every time I see a child. No, I don't. I'm like, oh my God, look at the child. I hope it doesn't like throw up or something.
They're
right?
adorable. Yeah. Right.
So like there's obviously just like a lot of weird stuff that's been affecting the psyche for a while.
Yeah, I think to me the big thing is to we do have an individual responsibility, but our individual responsibility isn't to fix it ourselves. It's to ask the governments and corporations and other entities to prioritize it and to give us choices, right? I mean, 10 years ago, you didn't have many choices for an electric car. Now you do. Our recycling options are improving. But like the recycling thing, a lot of material that you put in the recycling bin still winds up in the trash, still winds up in a landfill. But that doesn't have anything to do with whether you put it in there or not. If we want that to not be true anymore, we have to ask industry, we have to ask governments to develop rules and technology that force that stuff to be recycled, to be reused, to be put to better use, at least, than putting it in a landfill. And there's companies that are doing that or trying to do that, and there's government entities that are trying to enforce it. But we as the public have to ask for it. We have to push for that. And so I think a lot of it has to do with trying to take the onus off of the individual. So it's important for us to make those choices. And, I'm not going to fault you for cringing when you see somebody throw a plastic wrapper in the trash can. But at the same time, like, it's not that person. It's really the government and the corporate economy that's making that decision for you. Talia, I have a question for you as a linguist. Why isn't ChatGPT funny?
Why isn't ChatGPT funny?
It can't be funny. I mean, I did an experiment just for this podcast.
Oh, okay.
So I asked ChatGPT to write 3 jokes about global warming. And so these are the jokes.
Okay.
So why did the climate scientists break up with their partner? Because they needed space. There was too much heat in the relationship.
Okay.
Then 2, this one I actually kind of like. What's a polar bear's favorite game? Isolation. And then 3, why did the ocean break up with the land? It found someone deeper who really understands its waves. So then I asked, yeah, these are great. So then I said, can you write a joke that is not a pun?
Yeah.
Because I thought, maybe a more specific prompt. And so ChatGPT said, sure, here's a joke without a pun. Why did the climate activist bring a ladder to the meeting? Because they wanted to take their ideas to the next level. So isn't that a play on? I mean, what's the difference between a pun and a play on words?
Okay, so there's like so much that's going on here. So basically, oh God, this is so cool. Thank you so much for doing this. So the last joke that you just said, that basically seems to me like a large language model is depending upon like common words and phrases and what they understand is like funny, right? But it has no semantic relevance or like connection topic-wise to the thing that you asked it to make a joke about. Like taking something to the next level, like doesn't have to like inherently like something to do with climate. So that just seems to me like it's like trying to make a joke, but it's failing to like make that like topic connection with what you asked it to make a joke about. The one that seems the most interesting to me from like a structuralist linguistic perspective is the polar bear one, the isolation, right? Because that's basically their misunderstanding of like morphology, essentially. So basically, I think that what the large language model is doing there is latching onto the fact that some games have a similar like morphological structure. So like, what's a game that, what are like games that are like common? Like I to me, it seemed like it was latching onto the olation, like the shun of it all.
Yeah.
So like, what's a game that we could say has like that morphological structure? Like decatation.
I think this is the funny part.
No, can you think of anything?
Actually, to me, is you trying to think of what the hell's going on.
I mean, yeah. So like improvisation, right? Like, so like it just seems to, but it obviously isolation, because like isolation is not like a process, like an activity.
Right. It just
like,
has the word ice in it.
Yeah. So this, I guess, would be sort of back to like an original idea in like early computational linguistic stuff, which is like, do large language models understand the difference between syntax and semantics and the difference between semantics and pragmatics?
It sounds like no is the answer.
Sounds like, yeah. I think that like there probably is a way where you could get it to make a better joke, but
So here, well, let me keep going. So I said, can you write a joke that is not a pun or a play on words?
Okay.
And ChatGPT said, of course, here's a straightforward joke. Why did the sun go to school? S-U-N, sun.
Why?
To get a little brighter.
That's good.
And isn't that a pun or a play on words, though?
Oh, well, yeah, but I mean, that's like, that makes sense to me. Like, I feel like I could hear someone say that. Like, that would be an easy thing for them to say. Yeah.
It's a better joke. It's a better joke, right? But it's also still a pun or a play on words. Like, it doesn't know any jokes that aren't puns or plays on words. It seems like. So then I said, okay, these are terrible. Do you know any jokes that are actually funny? And it said, I appreciate your honesty. Here's a different approach. Why don't scientists trust atoms? Because they make up everything.
I've heard that before.
let me know if you'd like more. And I said, no, please stop.
I'm still stuck on this isolation thing, I gotta tell you. I think that is like super interesting. I'm still stuck on this.
The isolation thing. Oh, the isolation joke.
Because that's just so wrong, but it also makes sense because that's its understanding of like Asian, of like morphological frequent patterns of morphology and semantics. Like that's some kind of understanding that's not quite clicking there.
It's also kind of funny because it's just random. Like isolation isn't a game, right?
Well, that's the point though. If it's cremation is a process that's like a thing that happens, right? That has like action encoded, okay? Or why did I use cremation? Standardization. That's a process, right? Isolation isn't. And there's some kind of subtle pragmatic semantic, I don't know, difference there that it's not getting. But it is understanding syntax in some way, if we think of morphology as a part of syntax.
But is it funny?
Josh Willis, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Talia. It's been a blast talking to you. I'm a climate scientist for NASA. I study global warming. I do improvisational theater, and sometimes I do Elvis impersonations.
Thank you so much for listening to Tomato Tomahto. I have been your host, Talia Sherman, and that was Principal Research Scientist at NASA, Josh Willis. If you're feeling so inclined, and I hope you are, pass along this podcast, rate it, review it, give it 5 stars. Check it out on YouTube, and I will speak to you next time. Bye.